Canada, we don't know our country. What do I mean by we don't know our country? Of course, Canadians are rightly proud of our country. They love our country. They love being Canadian. But how many of us really know all the corners of Canada? Who amongst us has traveled to all provinces, all the major cities, multiple towns and hamlets across the country, reserves, villages, provincial parks, national parks, all the borders? Very few. The country is just too big. There's too little time. And by the way, travel is very expensive in Canada. The problem is that when you come to a position of influence, whether you're the Prime Minister, you're in cabinet, or you run a major institution, a company, a media institution, or you're a leading intellectual, you may be making decisions for and about a country that you don't know sufficiently well. And that is a problem not of individual intention or individual competence or capacity. That is a systems problem. We have not done enough in Canada systematically within the system to expose all of our future decision makers to all the complexities of Canada. In the process, we've also probably underinvested in the love of Canada, which comes from exploring the different parts of Canada. And this applies not only for new Canadians, but especially for people who grew up in Canada. So how do we remedy this? 3 points. First, let me invent an instrument which I'm going to call the Studin Stipend. Student, S-T-U-D-I-N, Student Stipend. By the age of 22, 23, every Canadian should receive about $5,000. And that money is strictly to travel across the country to a different region. One must show that one has traveled to the other region. The purpose can be variable, but the exposure itself will redound to the benefit of Canada. $5,000, you must travel outside of your region. And thereafter, 90% of the recipients in future will be traveling as a rite of passage because they love the country and because they remember that in their early 20s, late teens, they traveled outside the country and discovered how bloody huge and beautiful the country is. First point. Second point, amongst our civil servants in all the jurisdictions, federally in Ottawa, but of course all the 10 provinces, all the 3 territories, we must learn from the Indians and to some extent the Chinese and before them the Soviets. Yes, I'm saying we must learn from the Chinese, the Soviets, and the Indians today. We must rotate the civil servants, especially as they rise, very deliberately, very conspicuously across the jurisdictions. If you're to become clerk of the Privy Council in the 21st century in Canada, you should have spent time in St. John's, in Yellowknife, in Victoria, and in Winnipeg. All right? And of course, you should have a good understanding of Toronto and Quebec City and perhaps other smaller parts of the country. But you cannot have risen to the top only by living in Ottawa and working across the departments. You have an abstracted sense of the country and you will make terrible mistakes. This goes back to the feedback mechanisms for which even algorithmic decision makers in places like China and Singapore are always looking. Now, by the way, that is why they rotate across. Xi Jinping will have known where all the skeletons are buried because he rose by rotating through all the factories, through all the provinces, and going from the capital out to the regions. And the Indians do the same in the administrative service. So let's create a national system of rotation across most of the civil services of the country, very deliberately, without stinginess. Third point, the most underdeveloped and most prolifically tense part of the country in the next 10 to 15 years will be the North, the Arctic, which, by the way, is European Union sized in geography, and we've established that. Yukon is France, NWT is France, Germany, Ukraine combined, and Nunavut is bigger than them both. Across their total territory, they have 115 1,000 people, full stop. That's not enough to accomplish what the nation requires. It's also not enough to secure the well-being of those people living there. We need a system of national service for the Arctic and the North. We can find a nomenclature that is properly and originally Canadian, but it will be for the young people of the country, increasingly the top young people in the country across the sciences, the military, diplomacy, intelligence, the business sector, the cultural sector, civil society. They should have all spent time in the coming decades in the North, developing that region, learning about it, and turning it into one of the centerpieces of the Canadian project this century. So 3 points: student stipend, civil service rotation, non-stingy across the country so that everybody knows each other's jurisdictions. And by the way, you form very interesting fraternities, sororities, and networks of people who know each other and understand the decision-making processes of the other. Over time, it will improve the melding of the systems across the provinces, territories, and federal government. And third, a system, a very, very choreographed system of national service for the Arctic in particular this century that will really form a national psychology amongst the future leaders of the country across the sectors. Canada will benefit from it.